My name is Ryan Fee for Upswing Poker, and what we're going to be doing today is talking about how to play versus limpers. So if you're playing versus limpers, odds are you're playing in a casino live poker. Maybe you're playing online. Much of that doesn't happen these days, even in a good online game. Most of the players just raise pre-flop. So let's assume that you're playing live. If you're playing live and there's limpers in front of you, naturally what your inclination should be to do is to play tighter, because if somebody else is limping into the pot. They've said something about their hand. They say, I have a hand that's good enough to play. It could be, again, like it really depends on the player. They could be limping really tight range, they could be limping a really loose range, they could raise some hands so their limps are like sort of especially specific and weak. But they have, anyone who limps is going to have something better than a random player, because presumably players aren't limping 7-2 soft, maybe, who knows. So they're not going to have like a bottom like 40, 50% of hand, but they're also not going to have a top 10% of hand. So they're going to be somewhere from like 10 to the 50th percentile, of hands. And like many of those hands are going to be much better, substantially better than hands in the bottom 50th percentile. So they have hands a little bit better, and when you raise, sometimes players limp fold, but oftentimes they limp call. So you're not going to be getting that many folds pre-flop. So naturally, it's going to be harder for you. You're going to have to play tighter because you're going to get less folds pre-flop. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're playing in somebody who limps, or you're playing in a good game, you can naturally play looser because people are making mistakes and letting your hands realize more equity. They're folding when they should be calling, or calling when they should be folding, or just playing sort of like very face-up, very obvious, and you're just doing a good job bluffing them when you need to, or extracting value when you can, and sort of playing your hands correctly. So what actually ends up happening is I actually end up playing even looser live, which is really strange. That said, when I do play live, I tend to play in deep games, so everyone has at least 200 big blinds, and sometimes up to like 1,000, which will exacerbate the skill edge. And that's an important thing for playing like the looser hands, is that you can really end up sort of maximizing your edge by playing deep, because the game is more skillful. Whereas when you're short, it's very easy to somebody to 3-bet and basically put you all in, or to like flop whatever amount of equity and then get it in on the flop, or the turner just not folded because they're not in a particularly tough spot. It's like sort of a binary. They've made something, they haven't made something, and it's far more difficult for you to exercise any sort of skill edge because their decisions are fairly obvious. So in other words, like how do you play versus limps? So I typically don't raise the whole thing. So my default strategy is to raise, so let's say that somebody limps and I'm going to play, let's say 25% of hands in the cutoff, right, normally. What my default strategy would be is I'll fold like the bottom 3% or so, 2-3% of hands, and I will, let's say, limp behind with another 2 or 3% of hands, and then I'll raise the rest. So I end up playing, about 70 to 80% as many hands as I was going to, limping a couple of the ones at the bottom, like the small pairs, the weaker suited hands, and then dumping like the really weak hands. The really weak suited hands, the really weak offsuit hands. Never fold a pair pre-flop. So that's like in practice. That said, if I'm deep and it's a player who's not a good player to begin with, like I might already be opening 40% from the cutoff, and like this player's limped, and that's not going to change anything. I know I'm never going to get limp re-raised. So I'm at very low risk there. So just raising sort of my entire range, I get to play a bigger pot in position versus a weaker range and weaker player. So like by playing these bigger pots, I'm sort of like I'm exacerbating my edge. It's like let's say that your range has 55% equity versus the player that limps calls range, right? Now let's say that you're playing a 1-2 game. He limps for $2. Okay. If you raise to $8 and he calls and there's no rig, there will be $19 in the pot on the flop, and we're gonna bust out a handy dandy calculator, something that you guys should be doing all the time. All right, $19 in the pot times a 55% edge. So we're gonna realize about $10.50 out of that pot. Okay, but let's say instead we raise to $10. Or a hand is gonna have this, or a range rather, is gonna have the same amount of equity versus the limp call range. And so if you still have 55% equity, which is reasonable, in a pot that's now $23 times our 55%, we're going to realize almost $12.50 in equity in that pot. That said, the one calculation we forgot to do is we have to subtract how much money we put into the pot to find out our overall expectation. So In this one, we had to put in $10, right? So we're going to make about $2.50. We make $2.65. In the example where we raised to 4x preflop, we raised to $8. We returned $10.45 minus the $8 we had to put in, so we're making $2.45. So we make, on average, an extra 20 cents per hand. So we're winning more money by raising bigger. You know, to the point where, again, like, you really want to raise the biggest, where your range has, you know, like 51+% equity. You want to essentially raise the biggest size to where, like, it's at some point you don't want to, you know, raise to, like, let's say 100 because they're going to start limp folding. You want to raise to a size that makes it so that you want to raise to a size that makes it so that they're still calling and they're not exploiting you by only continuing when they have really good hands. You essentially force them to play their weaker hands and make decisions out of position, you know, again, as a weak player in a tough spot. So anyway, that is like sort of the gist of how to play versus limpers. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you did, you can subscribe to our Upswing Poker YouTube channel by clicking right here. If you want to find more videos of me, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel right here. And if you want to ask us a question or follow us on social media, click right down here and you'll be taken to our social media page at upswingpoker.com.